Hello, and thanks for clicking on this video. Welcome to a continuation of our Battle of Glory 2 Epirus campaign. Now, we're about to do a quick smash cut over the actual battlefield. In the interest of saving time, we are going to hop right into the actual battle, and I'm just going to explain what is going on. So, this is a continuation of our previous episode. This is part 2 as it stands. I'm not putting part in the actual title, just because I do not find that as an interesting title format. But what you're going to be seeing is basically the layout of the battle. I didn't want to bore you guys with the deployment of everything, so we're starting off right where the battle actually begins. I am now moving up my skirmishers, whether that be my light javelin men, my archers, and my slingers to the very front. Behind them, I am now moving up my pike phalanxes and various phalanx and pike regiments. The idea here is that I found this amazing hill on the right side of the battle. I intend to take the top of the hill and basically hold along all the edges, except for at the extreme left and the entirety of the right. I'm hoping that the Roman legions will not be advancing all the way around me, and that they will have enough time to reach my main line around that forested edge over on the left-hand side of the battle map that you can see right there. Basically, the premise here is that I am hoping my Italian foot will be able to extend around my flank over there on the far right, which is going to be relatively unguarded, supported by the cavalry regiments. However, to do this, I need to move up all my pike regiments to that very hilltop, and that's going to take up the majority of these first couple of turns. We also have an elephant, and we have King Pyrrhus of Epirus right there in the center. I'm moving him over to the right because I want all my cavalry on the far right, with my skirmish cavalry at the extreme of that position. So, looking at the Roman army real quickly, we can notice that it is very stretched out across the entirety of the campaign, or entirety of the battle map. Kind of how you would expect a normal battle formation to take place, but as I mentioned before, I noticed this really good hill position with that nice little forested grove kind of over on the top parts of it, and I figured what better position to take than an extreme hill position. The Romans are going to have to fight up it, it'll give me every advantage, and fighting on the difficulty that we were on and fighting against the Romans, I can use as much advantages as I can get. So we're continuing with pushing up all of our cavalry regiments to the very right flank, and my hope is that I can use my limited skirmishers here at the very front of my formation to engage with their skirmishers. I don't know exactly how many skirmishers they have in total, but it looks like the majority of them are over here, fortunately right in front of my own. I'm being very cautious about how I'm moving up because I don't want to allow the Romans to get the first attack off against me. I am following them up with all my pike phalanxes and various pike regiments so that we can hold basically the crest of this hill. I also want to be avoiding all that rough ground. While I'm going to have to step in it temporarily, I want to be not leaving my troops there in the long term. That's why I'm going to move this citizen hoplites over and move this one Italian foot up to anchor my extreme right position, because there is that one really rough terrain at the very crest of the hill where those, I believe, archers or slingers are currently standing. If you look at the very far right, not at the crest of the hill just before it starts sloping down. I move up my other various Italian foot, and my pike phalanxes to guard my left and right flanks. Again, the hope is that my Italian foot will be able to sweep around and actually do some damage while the Romans engage with my pike infantry along the crest of the hills. Moving on to turn 3, we still will continue to not see much action from the Romans, just because they're very docile during all of this. They let you kind of have the first couple of turns. Now I'm going to move my archers and other skirmish infantry off the crest of the hill, down into the low ground where I'm going to actually be able to get some hits off. I'm testing off these slingers, moving them forward just a little bit to see how far they can go before they can actually start firing. My archers have much greater range. I moved the very far one on the left up a little bit much further than I hoped for, because they weren't able to get any shots off, and the slingers I'm not able to get too many shots off in any situation. You can see me kind of testing what distances I can go before they actually start getting range. Neither my skirmishers neither my slingers nor my javelin men have the approximate range that I need. Now I'm going to move my raw pike phalanx to the very edge of the hill, and another thing that I'm going to be doing is leaving kind of a little bit of a gap, because my concern is that if I'm directly right behind my skirmish line with no avenue of retreat, they might not be able to pass through. Now, if you know Battle of Glory, you know this probably isn't too much of a concern, but I've noticed some difficulty in getting my troops back between my lines before, so I wanted to give myself as much breathing operative room, whatever you might want to call it, to play with as possible. I'm going to continue moving on my cavalry. I'm also going to do this in a very reserved manner because I don't want them getting targeted and isolated by the skirmishers. Primarily, I'm going to be worrying about my Zista 408 because these are my heavy Lancer units, and I want them reserved for when they can actually start doing rear charges against the Roman actual heavy infantry. I'm going to be avoiding moving Pyrrhus of Epirus. He's the one hidden right behind that forest right there, because I have a very bad tendency of putting my general in any strategic video game in a position of danger. So we're keeping him right behind that forest while the rest of my cavalry forces on the right. My pikes continue to advance on the left, and we are taking as much of a position along the edge of that hill line as we can. I'm moving my citizen hoplites who had been on my extreme right, just behind my main line, over to the center a little bit so that if I need them in support, I can have that. And I'm going to turn my mercenary hoplites in a similar manner. My elephants, I don't have quite an identified position for them. I don't know exactly where I want them. And King Pyrrhus of Epirus, as you can see right there, I'm just organizing him around a little bit, testing out different positions that I might put him in. If I want him to go all the way around, I turned him just a little bit so he doesn't have to go through the forest. Now the Romans are going to move up and they're going to start attacking my archer regiment unit that is right there at the very front. They have slingers and javelin coming forward. I'm worried about the melee capabilities of the javelin, so I'm being very cautious with that as we go forward. Over on the extreme right, they moved their troops all the way up to the front, which is going to let me hit them with my cavalry here right off the bat. My cavalry pushed completely and pushed 2 of their units all the way off, and this allows me to turn my slinger units to start attacking another one of their javelin units. This is great because it allows me to put as much damage on their javelin men, and I can get another charge off on those Roman javelin men, especially with my light skirmisher horses, which also means that my skirmishers horses are going to retreat on their own time, and I'm not going to worry about them being engaged or being pulled into that unadvantageous terrain. I wanted to avoid putting my heavy cavalry over there, so I'm also glad that the ones who did pursued along the front of the line rather than following them into that really nasty terrain up there. That really nasty terrain is also another reason why I chose the position that I chose to be in. Not only just taking the hill, but if I want to advance off with my skirmish regiments in the future, I can put them in that rough, drastic terrain just because it's going to hamper most of the Roman legion troops. We're going to continue throwing skirmish fire down against their skirmishers, just trying to do as much damage and disruptions against their skirmishers as possible. I probably should have tried to aim for a further disruption, fragmentation, or rout with just skirmish fire, but I wasn't too confident, so I wanted to get as much damage out as possible just to make it more likely that I can get a proper break or disruption later in the future. So while there's only currently 2 in disrupted mode, I'm hoping to get more off with the cavalry and further sustained javelin fire in the future in the next couple turns. Again, I'm going to charge the one at the extreme with my light cavalry, get a nice win over there on the far right, and I'm going to continue pushing with my cavalry here, armored cavalry here in the center. It's going to catch up them, which means that they're actually now safe from any potential future javelin attacks, because the javelins and other Roman skirmishers cannot do damage or throw into a melee combat, which is kind of nice. While my own skirmishers continue to do as much fire as possible. Now, you can see we've already gone from 2 to 3 and an auto break. Oh, 2 auto breaks. So 2 to 2 and an auto break from where we were just sitting. From 2 to 2 and then 2 auto breaks in this turn, whereas before we had just been sitting on that as a previously mentioned 2 disruptions. We're going to continue pressing whatever advantage I can, but again, I'm still worried about these archers, so instead of moving them up, I'm just going to turn them around, and I believe I saved their ammo this turn, just because I don't want to waste too much of it. With these javelin men, I'm trying to figure out the best position for them, see if I can get any damage off at all. If I move up to the very front here, I can get a nice turn throw and do between 54 damage and get a nice 35. My cavalry is going to continue advancing over along this right flank a little bit, just maneuvering them a little bit. I am slightly worried at this point by the fact that the Roman legionaries have not moved around, because if they don't do any moves, I'm going to be in a little bit of a predicament, because if they force me to come to them, well, I've only got 18 turns left to actually do some damage and break them in order to get a win. I've turned my far left unit of pikes completely around because I want to move them back a little bit. This turns out not to be the best decision, but my fear was that the Romans might not push up onto the hill if I didn't leave them in position. So I wanted to give them a nice weak corner where I might get 3 or 4 attacks off on them. We'll be seeing how that goes over the course of this battle in just a couple seconds. Now, thankfully, the Roman troops start beginning to move out and advancing against me. Most of their troops continue towards the center, which isn't exactly what I want, because I need to pull them over towards me. As I said, I only have about 18 turns to get that. The Roman skirmish infantry now takes... Skirmish infantry, is that a term? Skirmish line now takes whatever attack they can to get their attacks on, and I once again charge this extreme right with my horse cavalry, and then join that non-broken unit with my own light gentleman and get a break off. So that's nice. That puts me on a nice 4% advantage against the Roman troops. The Romans have so many troops here, I'm just worried about it. Now, what you're going to notice is at the very center, because of their own continuous fire, these slingers have become disrupted, and I am a little bit worried about their predicament because I want to prevent as many breaks, disruptions, and fragmentations as possible so that I'm not put in a position where I'm in trouble. Fortunately, I get another break here, putting me at a 6% advantage. However, I still can't move that slinger unit around. I then continue to put fire on the Roman skirmish line and also throwing some down onto the Roman infantry in the distance. I move my slingers and archers off the hill a little bit more because for the long term I won't need them on the hill. I'm going to move this one slinger unit very back behind my infantry units. I didn't need to leave those gaps that I was worried about, but better safe than sorry, so I have done so. I'm going to move my armored cavalry over here to the extreme right so they can follow up these other 2 cavalry because I want to give them as much maneuverability as possible while avoiding engagement with the Roman infantry preemptively or too soon. I've turned that 1 veteran armored cavalry completely around because I am concerned about the Roman skirmish line that's kind of in the center there and still exists. I wanted to be able to turn my attention towards them by running a cavalry unit around and kind of landing against them in the future. We'll see how well that pans out into the future, but at the moment we've got this 1 armored cavalry who's kind of still chasing that slinger unit, and he's got himself into a little bit of a predicament, but he still has enough, the unit still has enough room to maneuver around and gain whatever territory it needs so it can get out of that predicament. So I'm not too worried about that at the time being, especially because the Romans weren't able to chase it, and even if they were, the likelihood of my own troops just doing a fallback, even with some slight damage, is so high that I'm not too worried about the condition of that armored cavalry unit at the very moment. The Romans themselves continue to push up, advancing in a little bit towards what I want, with more of their troops doing a lateral move towards me. A lot of this turn is just spent with them moving in such a formation, with many of their troops doing a complete turn in the direction of the far right, so that's what ours is. Unfortunately, their skirmish unit does turn around and get some damage off on me, 38 damage, not the best thing in the world, but I can't do too much against that. However, as I mentioned, I do have the maneuverability to get out of there, so I instantly move that cavalry out as fast as possible, and I'm going to move my light javelin horses over across the battle so I can get as much damage on the Roman legions as possible. No reason just to keep them sitting behind the lines and hidden, just because they're not going to be able to do any long-term charges during this battle, so I'm not too worried about their condition as long as they don't break. I turned the slinger unit around in the hopes that I will be able to run them out of that position, and I'm going to continue firing on whatever Roman skirmish lines are still in position. Hoping for about 70 damage here, and we will get a 32, kind of on the low end, whereas this unit is going to fire into the Roman Italian foot over there, getting a nice 20 damage off. We're going to continue moving this slinger unit around just so I can have them available for positioning later. I don't remember exactly what happens to them. That Italian foot, I move up onto that rough terrain because the Italian foot, fortunately, is not disrupted by that rough terrain. So this is a good position for them to hold because, as I mentioned before, it's going to anchor my far right, and it's going to allow that unit to be very useful when I need them to. They're very flexible, and they can do a lot of damage, especially sitting up on that hill. That will come in clutch very later. Now, I move this pike phalanx down here because, as I mentioned, I want them in a position where I'm going to be able to take advantage of a 3-corner position. Actually, I turn them completely around. I don't believe I do that. No, I do in fact move them down into that open ground right there, still on the very top of the hill. And my hope is in the future I'm going to turn them around and take advantage of that one tile I'm hovering over, because I'm going to move this unit up so that I now have a potential to get 3 units on any unit that moves into that position. This kind of bites me later, and we'll kind of go over that when we get there, but it also allows me to move that one pike infantry over behind them, so I can take advantage of that rough terrain that's on the very top of the hill, because I don't want to move my own troops in there. In retrospect, if I were to do this battle again, and I had the opportunity to, I probably would have put another Italian foot there in that position, just because of what does end up happening. We'll be seeing that in just a little bit. Now, Xistophoros, the Xistophoroi, are going to be moving up on the extreme right, as well as King Pyrrhus. I want to keep King Pyrrhus relatively safe, but he's going to be in a decent position over there on the far right, especially with that rough terrain there, because it should hamper most of the Roman infantry. I'm going to continue moving my slingers over this direction towards the left-hand side of the battlefield, and we're going to call that a turn there while the Roman skirmishers continue to rout off the field. For the most part, we get some disperses, but the large part of this battle hasn't really begun yet because the Roman infantry are taking their sweet time to get over to our position. And the Roman skirmish line that still exists is just moving all the way south, which is why I want that one armored cavalry that I turned all the way around back on my far right to start maneuvering around to this edge to support this armored cavalry, who looks like they're going to be engaging and trying to mop up them, as in the Roman skirmish lines. There's still two skirmishers on this far right side, but I'm not too concerned about them, especially at this point. A lot of movement continues to occur from the Roman infantry line, with Hastati and Triarii moving about, as well as some Italian foot. The Italian foot aren't too scary, but those Triarii, and neither the Triarii in fact, but the Hastati Principe units are what I'm concerned about, especially with those general units either in the center on that kind of right hand side of the screen right now, and in the left center position. Not so much the Roman cavalry general, that's not too much of a concern, at least for the time being, and I don't foresee them being too much of a Now, as I mentioned before, they're going to continue to get some shots on the armored cavalry, and the Roman legion charging the end gets a nice pushing charge off, which forces my cavalry out of there. As I said, I'm not too concerned about that, because it just means that my cavalry is now out of there and not too much to worry about. Now I'm going to move this archer unit up onto that hill in that forest position, and this is where I find out that for some reason I cannot move my slingers back. The disrupted ones, this is likely due to the fact that they're disrupted, and they're also probably being slightly zone controlled by the Roman skirmishers over there who are behind them, which is probably likely preventing them from moving back behind my own lines. It's an unfortunate circumstance, and I had hoped to avoid it, but it's where they're at now, and they're also turned around, and I can't do too much about it. I continue to move one slinger up into that rough terrain, because if they're in the rough terrain, the Romans are going to have a harder time attacking me, and I'm going to move this armored cavalry just down slightly and prepare to charge into the Roman skirmish line that still exists. My other cavalry on the far right, and I'm looking right there at the very top right of the screen right now, they're kind of just outside the zone of that rough terrain, because my concern is if I move into that rough terrain, the Romans might do so with Italian foot, who are not going to have so much difficulty in that terrain, and that's going to mean that they'll be able to take advantage of that. So, if they do move Italian foot into those positions, I want to be avoiding taking as much damage as possible. So, instead I'm going to sit on the far edge of it, and if they come out across it, I'm going to take advantage of that. And if they just ignore my cavalry on the far side, it's going to be great. Now, what you're seeing is I turned that one pike buildings that I had moved all the way down into that pocket position, the one that's kind of in the L shape on the far left of my formation on the hill. I turned them completely around so that they can now get that three-pronged assault on the one unit that was concerned, on the one tile position that I want to pull the Romans into, and I also move the rest of my Italian foot over to the far right of my formation. They're kind of in the center right at the moment, but they're moving over to the right. More Roman units continue to disperse, and the Roman javelin men have moved over against my cavalry. This is relatively good for the time being, and it might pay off in some way for me in the future. Now the Romans continue to advance up on me, with 3 of their infantry units moving directly toward my cavalry. That's not too much of a concern, they'll never catch that cavalry, so I'll have to keep them moving, so I'm not too worried about that. What I am worried about is all the Romans on the far right of their formation, far left of their formation, far left of the Roman formation, who are kind of close to engaging my own units. Now, that's exactly what I want, but we're going to see how well that plays out going forward. Over on here on the far right of the Roman formation, the far left of the battlefield, the Romans continue to move down and relatively in a lateral transition towards the right, and their skirmishers continue to hammer my slingers there in the center. Unfortunate for those guys. Now I'm going to charge these slingers, or javelin, with my armored cavalry, which gets a nice disruption, fragmentation, and rear attack damage on them because they run away, which is as they're supposed to. Now, my 2 armored cavalry and veteran armored cavalry over here continue to push along there because I want to have them in support of that one who's now in the center of the field, just in case he gets a little bit overwhelmed. My slingers and various infantry, or various skirmish troops over here are going to operate in whatever position they can to do whatever damage to the Roman skirmishers and Roman infantry that are close to the rough terrain. And I think I completely forgot about my light javelin cavalry over there at the moment. You're also going to notice right there at the very center, next to the 2 general banners on the far left of my formation, my mercenary hoplites have moved into position right there at the crest of the hill, and I have got my Sister 4 over here. I'm not going to continue moving up because this is kind of the position I want them in. As I mentioned, I want my cavalry units in a position so that if the Romans cross that rough terrain, I can then hit them as they're coming out of it, so as to avoid getting any terrain modifiers against me. We still have 14 turns left. I'm not too worried about the turns right now just because there's still a lot of time and things are going pretty well for me. We are at a 6% advantage over them and I'm feeling pretty comfortable in my position. I am going to turn that pike around because I am considering moving that pike over to the extreme left, because one of my concerns is that there is a potential that the Romans circle all the way around and put a lot of pressure on the left-hand side of the hill rather than actually going all the way to the front of the hill. And in the event that they do that, I'm going to need to extend the line down to the south rather than along that left side. Right side. I'm going to need to extend it along the south-left side rather than along the far right side. Now we're going to continue into the enemy's turn, letting the Roman infantry continue to move about. I've got my archers in that forest right there. If I were smart, I would probably leave them there, but I don't think I do that. But for the most part, it's going to be a continuation of what we've seen over the last couple of turns with the Romans just moving towards the right in order to engage with my troops, because I do not want to fight them on the open plains where they would have most of the advantage. I really wanted this hill position, so as soon as I could get that hill position, I stuck there and I just held on there. The Roman skirmishers now retreat from not only my position in the rocky terrain, but also their position over there, and my cavalry who got charged out of that pocket where they had been are now charged by the Roman skirmish infantry. Unfortunately, it's a nice continuation of the battle over there with our armored cavalry because one of their units routes, and this pulls my armored cavalry into them. I'm bringing up this veteran armored cavalry to support that one because there's still a lot of skirmishers over there, as well as this armored cavalry. The elephants I'm going to continue leaving kind of in the center there just because I want them easily available. I do a quick fallback in the hope that I'll be able to get this light javelin horse out, or that on its battle play it will do a fallback. Unfortunately, it does not in that situation. It does a little bit of damage. Comes out on top of the damage, losing only 5 to 13, but it's not enough for any real decisive action to happen. Now, with my archers and skirmishers, I continue to do as much damage to the Roman infantry over here. I'm kind of cautious about moving all my skirmishers into the same position because I'm worried that the Roman Italian foot here and any other infantry might charge my position. I'm also going to move these slingers up so that I can potentially do some damage to whatever infantry decides to start pushing up the hill. Now we can see them on the slope of the hill and they're just kind of doing a face-off against my own troops, but for the moment nothing has happened too much. Other than the battle against the skirmishers and the javelin horsemen on the in the center of my own formation. I continue moving my Italian foot over to the right, except for this one unit who is going to continue down to the bottom, because as I mentioned before, there is that concern where I have to extend that left downward position along the edge of the hill right there, just because of how many Romans are there. I consider moving these guys down the hill, but what I also noticed is I have to turn them so that there is no risk of them being flank attack, so instead I move them there. And what I really wish I had done here is not put them in square, but had found a way to move this pike phalanx out of this position into an advantageous position and move that Italian foot into that rough terrain. As I mentioned earlier, that would have been one of the few moves that I think would have absolutely helped me later in this battle. But unfortunately, it's not easily done, and I don't want to risk them being caught on the low slope, so I do not put them there. We're going to end turn and move on to the next turn with a 7% advantage against the Romans. We see that unfortunately their own skirmishers over there in the center have kind of rallied, and they are chasing this cavalry unit that has been pulled out and doing a lot of damage to them. There's also now a concern with that Roman cavalry general over on the far left-hand side of the map, far right-hand side of the Roman position, is going to be a little bit disadvantageous towards that own cavalry unit. Fortunately, at this point, we get that attack over on the hill. The Roman unit moves up into that little pocket I wanted to create, which means that now they are engaged with one of my units, and I will be able to start putting some pressure on them with my other units. Unfortunately, there's also a couple other positions the Romans can hit that unit from, and we'll be seeing that play out over the course of the next couple turns. I think there was also a flank attack at some point, but I might have just missed it, because I might not have been paying as close attention to that position as I wanted to, but I do recall being irritated by a surprise flank attack that I endured over there, and I was very surprised by why, because I thought I turned everybody around. Prepared for them. And now my cavalry over here is disrupted, which is not good. I'm continuing to charge my skirmishers over there in the rough terrain or around the rough terrain, which is kind of what I was worried about, but due to how I've got them spread out, there was no excess damage, and unfortunately their own slingers charge my archers over here and push them out of the force and get a nice disruption on them on top of that, which is extremely unfortunate. I continue to just play out whatever battle occurs between the light horses and the javelins over there, getting a nice win against them, and I begin attacking the Roman who's in the pocket with my now supporting pike troop. So we'll be seeing how well that plays out. I'm going to turn this light javelin to sling into the Italian foot, and these archers are going to hit whatever target is available to them. I'm also going to move these slingers to continue putting pressure on to, not move, but, utilize them to put pressure onto the Italian foot who are just standing downhill. Because, really, if they're going to just stand there and take the damage, well, that's on them. I'm not going to move the mercenary hoplites up into this position, because that would be a bad idea. Instead, I move Nikos Stratos, son of Lycurgus, as a pike unit up into that position just a couple turns, because I am still waiting on that light horseman to break. Meanwhile, my horses over here now charge that one unit who to hit them and try to get away from the other skirmishers that are still over there while my armored cavalry comes over to support them. We get an unfortunate break over here, moving us to our first 2% losses, and I move my armored cavalry up to consider attacking up that hill. However, I do realize this is going to be a terrible idea, because not only is it uphill, but they're also on the rough terrain, which would disrupt my armored cavalry. However, rather than charging, I might still move in an attempt to attack, but it will not be at the very base of the hill. If I am going to do that, I am going to organize them down here across that rough terrain, so that if the Roman slingers pursue off that hill, I can charge them in the nice terrain just below it. At least that would be the hope at that point. My pikes over on my citizen pikes, I believe, on the far right are still turned around. I should do something about that, but I still haven't moved them. However, the Romans haven't taken advantage of that, and I'm not going to be too worried about it. They're not going to take advantage of it. Meanwhile, we're going to continue to move our various skirmishers around so that we can keep them in position, threatening the Roman flanks. My elephants, I'm going to consider moving to the far right, or far left, but instead I'm going to move the other citizen hoplites down. Oh, those are the raw ones on the far right, and the citizens are down here at the very bottom. Meanwhile, my elephant comes down to support, and I continue bringing the Italian foot down. We're going to end that turn and move on to our next one, see how this battle plays out. We get a nice win and a disruption against that Roman unit that's come up on the hill, because I was betting on that doing as much damage as possible, which, as it turned out, it has worked. There's a charge impact over here against one of my other generals. Again, the Romans are downhill from it, so they take the loss on that, and there is an unfortunate draw battle on the far right there against that one unit who is kind of holding my entire setup right there. At this point, I do get an unfortunate flank attack because the Hastati Principe moved into the forest right there, and I was not betting on that because I thought, hey, if they do that, they'll be disrupted. But even being disrupted, their flank attack does a lot more damage than I was betting on, and they have basically put that entire flank at risk now because, hey, that unit has a severe morale shock to it, which is not the best situation for it to be in. So that is how that played out. I was very unhappy about that one. However, for the most part, the Roman infantry and main formation continues to push over to the right, and now their Roman general is threatening my own troops. Their skirmishers continue to retreat on the far right and continue to harass my horsemen in the center and the other ones that have moved across to support them. However, I am tying up 3 other Roman infantry units over here on the far right, including another general, as they, or far left side of the map, far right side of the Roman formation, as their general goes to pursue my own troops. We get a couple of nice wins over there, especially against the Roman infantry and against the Roman skirmish unit. I do not want to attack into that forest because I understand that it'll be bad for me, so I don't do that. Instead, I move this armored horse cavalry up to the hill right there, just to put pressure on that slinger unit. In the long term, that was a terrible idea, but I don't know why I did it in the short term. It was just a decision to make, and I start preparing to move this armored cavalry around and out so I can extract them from that terrible situation, while my light javelins continue to put as much pressure as possible on the Italian foot, who by all metrics should have been able to charge me, and I'm surprised that they didn't, because they could probably have done a lot of damage to my own skirmish line. These triarii here are going to just suffer because my own slingers and archers are going to lay damage onto them, and I'm going to move that slinger unit up to the far top of that rough position so that I can continue to get as much pressure on the Roman back as possible. We're going to take the battles here, starting off with the advantages that we have over there, and break one of the Roman units right there. Because we are in battle here, we're going to continue pushing down the hill with our own general, getting another decisive win, and our light javelin horsemen are continuing to be stuck even though those skirmishers are on the edge of collapse. So unfortunately, they just sit there. I do notice that there is a nice potential for a win there. However, I don't immediately take it. Instead, I'm going to continue moving my Italian foot out to the far right in the hopes that they'll be able to completely encircle the Roman mass by going around the far right. I move Nicostratos up to that position, as I mentioned earlier, just because I need them at this point, because even if the cavalry doesn't break, there's still potential for a massive breakthrough to happen right there, just because the cavalry are now blocking up one of the worst positions for them to be blocking up. I also turn one of the lower pikes at the very left south of my position so that they can fill in that position in the event that my fractured unit decides to break, because with them being so low on morale, I would not be surprised if that happens. So I want something prepared to fill in that gap in the event that everything goes south where that distressed unit is. With my cavalry, I'm going to now move them closer towards the edge of that rough terrain, just because I want them prepared to swing down on the Roman flanks, which seem to be appearing along the edge of the hill right there. Because as you can imagine, if these cavalry now come all the way down across against the backs of those Roman troops, it'll be a nice morale shock to them, which can get a lot of damage off. In fact, we still have King Pyrrhus, my commander of chiefs, over here, who he's safe, but we'll see how long that lasts. They're just in a nice position where they'll be able to charge the rear of any Roman troops along that hillside and get a massive break. We are probably about to be calling that another turn right here, although I need to figure out what I'm going to be doing with these slingers. Although I was moving them back, there's no real point in keeping them turned around. Instead, we're going to maneuver them over to the right again, hoping to get them into that little disruptive full terrain over there. My elephants, I'm just going to leave on the hill because there's no real benefit to moving them off it, and keeping them in a position where they can support our troops is actually better. The Roman skirmish line continues to retreat. This is very good for this turn, just because having them not harass my cavalry is actually pretty nice. So the fact that they decide to run away is really good. As for my own cavalry, they're going to continue maneuvering to be pulled back during the next turn, but for now they're kind of just stuck over there. Whereas the majority of the Roman troops are going to be moving over to the right-hand side of the battlefield as they continue to encroach upon this hill. This is a really nice hill position. I'm just glad that I had it, because it's probably one of the reasons why I won this battle. But for the most part, not a lot's happening right now, just because there's not a lot that the Romans can do, except for throw some more javelins into what's left of my cavalry before they continue their retreat and continue to pursue me with their own general over there. Now, they do get a decent charge off in the center with their own, I believe that's Italian foot, charging my raw pike phalanx over on the far right and doing a lot of damage to that disrupted unit on the far left side of my formation. However, they do break, and their skirmish troop also breaks. That was finally my light cavalry. However, this is the turn that I actually forget on my light cavalry, because I know for certain that I do not maneuver them around, and this leads to them breaking. However, we are going to be at a nice 11% advantage over the Romans at this point, so a little bit of a surprise loss, not too bad. However, I am going to prepare for that one fractured pike troop to break, because there is a concern that they will do so. Now, I do need to move up into that little pocket that's been created by my own light cavalry, just because I don't want the Romans getting on top of the hill, so I put the mercenary pikes over there, and I put some pressure on the Italian foot and Triarii units that are on the Romans' far left, engaging my own far right, or prepared to engage my own far right just before they actually engage. I also continue moving my Italian foot around the edge so that they are in a position to attack or deny any potential maneuvering of the Romans and set up those cavalry charges of my own. I'm also going to now take the advantage of having my own Italian foot charge their Italian foot downhill, getting a nice fallback and maintaining our position at the top of the hill while putting the Italian foot into a fractured disposition. I'm going to move my own archer unit out to do as much damage to the Roman infantry that just spread out across the battlefield at the base of the hill as possible before they actually start engaging. Unfortunately, these slingers aren't able to do anything no matter where I put them, so I just decided to move them out to the far edge of that disadvantageous terrain while I move my own armored cavalry out of harm's way by continuing to either run them away from that general and that Roman javelin troop. My veterans are going to push up a little bit in the hopes that if the disrupted unit is caught, they can provide some support, while this veteran armored cavalry is just in like the worst position possible. But for now, it doesn't really matter too much. Again, I'm considering moving this pike phalanx out, but if it was a bad idea earlier, it's a terrible idea now, because the risk of them getting caught out would be just terrible. So instead, they're going to sit there while I wish my Italian foot could just deal with that skirmisher sitting on the rough terrain. We end this turn here in just a second, and we see some battles that I forgot to play out, but we get a nice draw and then an unfortunate loss. However, my Spartan unit surprisingly doesn't break despite all of it, and my own cavalry manages to extricate itself, which is nice. The Romans continue to charge up the hill, and now they're engaged with my mercenary pike phalanx, which is decent enough for me because it gets a nice win victory against them, doing a 62 damage to the Roman troops who have now engaged them. You can see the Romans commander-in-chief, Decimus, standing there kind of in the center of everything, advancing close to the edge of the hill, but not quite up it just yet. Meanwhile, the stragglers of the Roman infantry continue to advance up, and now their general over there on the cavalry unit has turned in acknowledgement of my own armored cavalry that are coming along that way. There's another flank charge over here, where the Romans charge continue to be exposed. Horse infantry has now been pushed up the hill, or horse infantry, yeah, that's it. Now, horse troops on the hill. However, that one unit that I was afraid of does disperse and does not. They break and then they disperse because they just taken so much damage. For myself, the only response to this is obviously to move into that pocket because I really want to maintain this pocket. This might be where the flank attack comes in now that I think about it. Just because of the obvious position in which that one pike on the side is. And I also don't want to move these Italian foot out now to try and get rid of those slingers that are on the far left, just because the Roman infantry is definitely way too close. If they weren't too close before, they're way too close now for sure. But we are going to continue using our own skirmishers here on the disruption terrain and attacking the Italians where they are, including getting a nice shot on the back of these starting flank units, and moving up these archers to do the same. Then we're going to use our mercenary hoplites to do as much damage to the troops that are coming up the hill, getting a nice disruption with 82 damage. And I would ideally like to move my Zistophoroi and Pyrrhus down to get a flank charge on these Triarii and Italian foot. But I noticed that it won't be too bad of an attack if I were to charge this fractured unit, so that's exactly what I do. I get a nice break. Unfortunately, the Romans hold firm, and it doesn't really gain me any advantage. However, I am able to move my slingers up and get a nice hit on the front of this Triarii. Unfortunately, that one Italian foot of my own is now exhausted. However, I can get a nice fallback on these raw pikes and move these Italian foot up to kind of do what I just did to the others and have them at the crest of the hill where they're going to be able to charge. I'm also going to move these Italian foot into a disposition where they're going to be able to move along the flank and engage those remaining Triarii along the extremes in just a second. Unfortunately, we are sitting at an unfortunate 7% loss at this point. However, we do have a 13% loss for the Romans, which puts us, if you can do math, at a 6% advantage over the Romans in terms of total score. As for my cavalry on the extremes, all the way out there in no man's land, they continue to maneuver in order to avoid being captured, whereas my other horses just end up sitting there at the very bottom of the map for a moment. Or at the very top where they're also doing nothing, but they're kind of set up for something. My pike phalanx is going to maneuver just to plug in that gap that might appear as these horses break, because I don't really want the Romans pushing through the little gap, although they shouldn't be able to push through the gap. However, we do get a nice fallback rather than a complete break, although they are fractured from my own light horses now, who have managed to finally retreat behind my lines. The Romans, of course, do charge up the hill, get a nice impact with me, and another impact with me over on my far left, kind of in that pocket that you keep trying to create, which is fortunate enough in that the Romans are there, and they can't really do much else to me, and they're not able to get out of that forest off the hill edge right there. They continue to attack along my side, and they're continuing to maneuver into that position over on the far left, where they're just going to be attacking us. Especially that general who's not the commander-in-chief, but actually one of these sub-generals. If you notice, the main commander-in-chief's kind of sitting formally at the center of the screen. Now he's at the center right of the screen if you're seeing that. And he just hasn't moved on the position, whereas the Roman cavalry general is just sitting at the crest of his own hill now on the opposite side of the map, where there is also another hill. Taking that hill plot wouldn't have been a bad suggestion either if I thought about it. But it would have meant that my skirmishers weren't in such a good position. However, we do get, going into next turn, a nice win against the Triarii, who are advancing up the hill against my mercenary pikes, and allows my slingers and such to get damage onto the backs of various Roman troops in the center of my own formation. I am about to send my own Italian foot down the hill, noticing that it's, again, kind of similar to the previous attack where they have such a nice advantage that I can just get a good win over them, although unfortunately it doesn't break the own Italian foot of the Romans who are on the slope of the hill. As for my two Italian foot sitting at the extreme edge of my formation, as soon as my slingers fire their shot, I believe we go for a charge on the Triarii unit that's standing right here, because I don't quite want to send in my own cavalry against them, although at the current situation it would be an unfortunate loss, likely to be a loss if I were to attack them. So we avoid doing that. I don't think I retreat him. No, but I also don't throw the cavalry in, because that wouldn't be a good idea. And I spare the cavalry for later on the far right, whereas these Italian foot, who are now in a terrible position because they're slightly downhill, need to start maneuvering so that they can get out of the way of the Romans' own Italian foot. At least I think the ones in white are Italian foot, or the Hussari. Meanwhile, I move that light horse out of the pocket that had been created where they had fallen back to, just so they're kind of out of the way. We get a nice win against the Triarii, who are attacking our mercenary hoplites. It gives them a break, which disrupts the other supporting unit who's been attacking my mercenary hoplites, and gets me a nice setup to where we can be prepared to advance out. That one Italian foot, who my own Italian foot on the far right had attacked, is now attacked by my own pike phalanx going down the hill, which actually puts them into a disruption, getting a nice victory, so that was pretty good. This is with the breaking of the unit who'd been attacking my mercenaries at the center of my formation. This puts us at a 14-7 with a 7% advantage. And I move my own pike phalanx up into the pocket where my light horses had previously been. I continue not to push too much with my pikes over on the far left, just because I don't want to aggressively push the slingers off of that rough terrain, because I don't want to be in it myself. So we're just going to sit there and continue to take slinger fire, because I don't have too many options other than run away, but that would be the top of that hill position. Very exposed, which is something I want to avoid. However, my cavalry continues to escape along the southern edge of the battlefield, and my other cavalry now goes to threaten Roman skirmishers that are at the center of the battlefield, which has become kind of the far left of my own position, far right of the Roman position, and essentially no man's land. Now, I do believe I move my own cavalry into this rough terrain just because I want to be setting them up for a future rear attack against the Roman infantry unit that's sitting right here. So, King Pyrrhus and the Zistophoroi, as well as any armed cavalry that's over there, although I believe they're all Zistophoroi actually, except for King Pyrrhus himself, who's actually armored cavalry, unfortunately. They're just going to continue, or at least begin, flanking around and going through the hard terrain because there's nothing kind of threatening them if they do so, except for one Roman unit who's so far away from it that by the time they get over there I have so much time to maneuver, and actually the Roman Italian foot goes down towards the battlefield. However, they do attack up the hill, pushing my own pike phalanx, unfortunately, off the top of the hill and getting a nice advantage for themselves, which has kind of put my entire formation on the far left and southern part into a tricky position, because if they gain the top of the hill, I don't have that advantage over them, and their troops will be in a one-on-one head-to-head on their terrain, so to speak. So I need to figure out what I'm going to be doing about that in the next turn here. However, they're going to continue finishing up their turn by maneuvering their various slingers, javelins, and other skirmish troops around, and in fact using their slingers to do some damage on my own troops. For a moment, the tide of battle continues to go our way, although there is a predicament where it might not. A decent clash in that little pocket that I've created continues to go on with some nice wins and a couple draws, and at the very left-hand side of my own formation, we get a nice break against the Romans, which leads to a couple pursuing disruptions, and a disruption actually in the very center of their own formation. I continue to move my own Italian foot back a little bit, just so that they're not off the hill themselves, and I push for a break against these troops who are assaulting my mercenary hoplites, kind of in the center of the formation, whereas my own slingers and such are going to now move back, because I'm worried that they might be caught out against those Roman troops who are advancing against them. So I move one light javelin man over to their flank, and I'm just going to be taking what I can to clear the way for these cavalry to get whatever charges I can in just a second. However, unfortunately, that one archer unit instead doesn't pursue, but opts to stay where it is, which just puts them in a position where they're just kind of blocking up my own troops. I consider charging this Italian foot with my own Italian foot, but instead I charge down the hill because that's going to be more advantageous, because I'm going to be able to break one unit in just a second here, or not, because they're going to hold firm. I know I break them either this turn or next turn, whereas I can have my own raw pike phalanx kind of come up to support along the edges and start pushing against the Romans far left and wrapping up my far right around their entire formation. I do briefly consider maneuvering my own Zistophoroi into a position where they're going to be able to charge. However, by the time I get them into that position, I'm convinced that that Roman who's over there will break, so instead I opt to, for the moment, leave them there while I pull back my own damaged light javelin forces so that they're no longer in the way and not receiving cut out. However, I do move my elephants in to attack the Romans who gain the top of the hill at the very bottom of my formation and get a nice win against them with the unit that they're currently engaged with. Over in the pocket, just on the far left center of my own formation, I'm going to continue fighting the battle's little pocket, seeing how well that turns out, because for the moment it's going our way, and we're also going to charge these Roman skirmishers just to get as much damage off, and we get a nice fragmentation with 52 damage over there. We're also going to continue pulling back our veteran armored cavalry and armored cavalry who are at the very bottom of the map now, just so that they're going to be useful in the event that anything happens in the future. Now up here at the very top, and I'm still considering what I'm going to be doing with my own Roman heavy cavalry, considering moving them down, but I don't believe I do so. Instead, I'm going to utilize my pikes and potentially get a decent charge off with them. However, I am certainly going to be moving these raw pike phalanx up in just a second here. As it goes with my Zistophoroi, instead of charging down to attack the rear of the Roman formation, I maneuver my veteran armored, who are directly associated with King Pyrrhus, into a position where, if it needs to, they can charge the Romans who are currently engaged, whereas my others are now moved around so that they can continue to put pressure onto the Roman flanks in just a second. My own Italian foot at the very bottom of the map are just going to sit right there and wait for the Romans to maneuver themselves. and it takes me a minute, but I know for certain I do finally use either this pike phalanx or the raw pikes to charge the Roman troops who are just sitting at the base of this hill. And so I turned that one, and with my raw pike phalanx, I believe I moved them down the hill slightly, because it's better to have them at the base of the hill. No? Yeah, better to have them on the side of the hill where they're about to get a flanking charge than to leave them at the top of the hill where they can't do anything. Because I want them maneuverable for the future. I knew I did, I just didn't know how early I did it, because for a moment it looked like it was going to be the next turn, but I knew I didn't wait that long. However, my own mercenary hoplites are now engaged at the very center of my formation against another Roman unit who has tried their luck pushing up the hill. This might go well for them, we have no idea yet. Little note, I highly doubt it's going to go well for them, because everything up there is going my way. The Romans, for the most part, continue moving around their excess troops, and I think at some point I'm going to get a break against that javelin unit, which unfortunately is going to leave that one armored cavalry kind of exposed, but there's not much to do about that other than getting a nice win off that breaking javelin unit of the Romans themselves. However, for the most part, there's also going to be some maneuvering of their own troops. Over in the pocket that I keep mentioning, we get a couple draws and a appealing loss against my pocket unit. However, they don't break, instead they just continue to hold, there's not even a disruption. But as I mentioned before, the armored cavalry does break one of the Roman skirmishers who are still left on the battlefield, and we get a nice win against the Triarii, and a decent break against the Roman Italian foot. However, the Triarii who are next to them hold firm, don't take any morale loss from that, and continue to battle my own troops, unfortunately for us. I'm sure the Romans, if it had been a player, would have been ecstatic. I'm going to take this opportunity to move my own slingers and archers in a position where they can continue to do damage to the Roman troops, and I get a decent shot against the Roman general, Decius Mus, who's sitting in the center of the field, just back from everything. Very clever of the Romans not to actively be attacking, and I use my own Italian foot now, who's kind of relieved from everything, to attack the Triarii. They get a disruption, and then supported by their fellow Italian foot, they get a fragmentation on that Triarii who's left, which means that I do not have to use my cavalry on a wasted turn attacking that unit, because they'll probably break next turn. However, I am going to play out the battles in the pocket, getting a nice disruption early against the Roman butch, who's right there. I'm also going to use my elephant to see what damage I can get, getting a nice attack against them, and I'm going to continue moving the veteran armored and armored cavalry who have been kind of running away from the battle, to continue running away from the battle, essentially, so I can bring them back to the battle. If that's very confusing, I apologize, but that's kind of what their intent is. This has also had the effect of putting us at a nice 23% of Roman losses to our own 7% losses, which has the effect of putting us at a 16% advantage over the Romans. Now, with my raw pike phalanx, I'm going to consider charging the Roman troops who are on the hill, but I don't do it just yet. Instead, I believe I charge them with a pike phalanx here at the very top of the hill, because if I get a win and they break, which I do, it puts the Romans at 26% loss, and it still leaves my raw pikes in a position where they're still maneuverable. Whereas the pike phalanx that did charge is no longer maneuverable. So this has the knock-on effect of putting me in a position where I have options, whereas if I just used that pike phalanx, or the raw pike phalanx, I would not have had many options. I now have Nicostratus Lycaros leading a pike phalanx, join with my mercenary hoplites against the Roman Triarii unit who's trying to charge up the hill. So much for the idea of sending in the Triarii last. Unfortunately, our pike phalanx gets one of our pike phalanx over on the right kind of center of our formation gets a draw charging downhill. However, the Romans that they're fighting are disrupted, so it's not too much of a concern. Over at what has become kind of the center left of our formation, kind of the center bulge of our formation, where I keep talking about the pocket, we play out the battles over there, seeing how well our units do this turn, whereas our Zistaphoroi under Archippos now advance a little bit out of that advantageous terrain, so we can start really getting into a position where we're going to be able to put as much damage and pressure on the Roman troops as possible. However, there is this annoying side effect of with how many Roman troops have broken such rapid succession, there are just a bunch of routed Roman units sitting in kind of another central pocket that's kind of blocking them off. So I kind of wait for that to clear up a little bit before I actually start moving. But I want to make sure that I actually get rid of them, because otherwise there is the chance where one of their units might rally like they just did, and putting the Romans back at 23% rather than 26% they had been at. Over here at the very south of my position on the far left of my battle, where my troops extend along the southern edge of the hill, one of the Roman sub-generals have pushed up the hill, and they get an amazing win against my own troops, immediately putting them into a disruption with a 162 troop loss. And in the very no man's land of the battlefield where they stood off skirmishers and my armored cavalry is kind of exposed, they get some damage out with both javelins and slingers. Excuse me, sorry about that. But for the moment, the battle continues to progress our way over in the pocket that I keep mentioning. The troops get a decent attack against theirs, and on the far left, we finally see that Triarii, who've been holding up my own Italian foot, break and rout. A couple more decisive wins in the center of the formation around the pocket sees the Romans disrupted, but there's no clear breakthrough on either side. The Romans who are fighting my mercenaries, or at least around my mercenaries, have fragmented due to some significant losses, and currently the Romans are sitting at a nice 25% loss. If you're curious what this percentage difference is, there's about 18% difference because we have not changed from our own 7% loss for the Epirotes under Pyrrhus. My armored cavalry along the southern flank of the field continue to come back, and we need to decide what we're going to be doing with our elephants, who are still engaged with the Roman infantry at the top of that hill. However, before we do that, we're going to move our javelin troops down here, continue to just harass whatever troop Romans do exist, as well as some extra skirmish troops that we still have sitting around. Just because they're in a position where they can't really be threatened by the Romans, and no matter what they do. However, our archers are in a decent position where they can actually, if I wanted to, hit the Roman general himself. However, it wouldn't pay off too much, especially with how far away he is, so instead I just hit the Italian foot that's over here. Continuing to survey the battle, we take our pike phalanx and continue to push down the hill against the Italian foot, who are at the slope of the hill, getting them to finally break, as well as finally breaking, or not breaking, but attacking that Roman troop who had rallied and is sitting on a fragmentation. I'd hope that they broke, but we are back up to 27%. Our own pike phalanx and Italian foot are going to be held up for a moment because there is this annoying Roman Italian foot at the crest of our hill, who's, though they're broken, they're kind of just sitting in the way of everything. Whereas my mercenary hoplites and castratos is currently holding what has become the far right of my formation. If we turn this on a 90-degree angle and look at what previously been my far left as now my center, because the Romans who had been going around my flank no longer exist for the most part, and there's a decent chance where I can start flanking around them. I play out the battles in the pocket once again, just seeing how well that goes. No breaks on either side, but the Romans are dangerously close, and my own troops are holding up pretty well, as this time they do not suffer a flanking attack. So, that's always good to see. We finally do, I believe, decide to charge down the hill against the Hastati Principe with our own pike phalanx, led by Linos, son of Euthamios. Or maybe it's not this turn. Pretty sure it's this turn, but it's not happening just yet. However, I do move my skirmishers around who are sitting up at the top of the hill, and I turn my own pikes who are on the top of the hill around, because I'm going to want to maneuver them over to the left in the event that something breaks over there. There is always that possibility. As for myself, I do use the Zistaforoi, who do not have a general unit, to charge the Italian foot in the hopes that that breaks them, which with an astounding win, they do get a nice break. It also has the knock-on effect of fragmenting a supporting Roman unit who is just beside them. Unfortunately, there's no good moves for Acropos, son of Archipos, son of Agapetos, who is also on a Zistaforoi. I apologize for my pronunciations, but those are hard ones to pronounce. I'm extremely concerned about these citizen hoplites facing off against this Roman general, but there's not too much of a choice because at some point I will have to play that out. However, I'm concerned that we will lose our advantage to inevitably break. I don't have too much of a choice, so I'm pretty sure I get to play it out in just a second here. I know I don't have my pike buildings join them. I think I just put out the citizen hoplites to see what occurs. And instead of breaking, fortunately, this disrupted citizen hoplites decides to hold and rolls a nice, draw, which means that they continue to fight the battle, and it allows my Italian foot to get engaged with the Roman troops who are coming up the hill. However, they get an unfortunate loss, although it doesn't have too much of a knock-on effect because my own troops do not break, fragment, or get disrupted or anything like that. So that's a nice turn of events. However, that is going to be the end of this turn, leaving us at 30% to our 7% with a 23% advantage over the Romans. The Roman troops who have broken are finally clearing out that pocket of just routed, non-dispersed, assorted troops who were blocking the way of my cavalry, and now my cavalry will be in a decent position next turn to start hammering the flanks of the Roman infantry. Their own skirmishers continue to harass the one cavalry unit who I maneuver out to the center of the battlefield. Unfortunately for that unfortunately for our own cavalry unit, so they're just kind of isolated again, but they do not break or anything, they're just kind of down there and taking damage. Finally, the Roman general pushes back my citizen hoplites by getting a decent win against them, losing 100 troops of my own as that occurs. In the center, around the pockets I keep talking about, the Romans continue to apply pressure, which just leads to 2 of their units breaking, and my elephants advancing up into the disadvantageous terrain that was up there, as well as some Roman units completely dispersing, which is nice to see. I'm going to use my slingers now to harass their own slingers potentially. Actually, no, I don't. Instead, I use my javelin horses to charge them. Unfortunately, this means that their slingers have now retreated and pulled my javelin horses into another unfavorable position. I'm not really a fan of my javelin horses in this battle. However, those armored cavalry and infantry cavalry that had been all the way on the other side of the battle and had been running across the southern part of the field this entire time are now in a position where they're going to be able to return to the battlefield, which means that I'm going to be able to apply pressure to the Roman troops who are harassing and threatening my southern left flank. As for my slingers, I do move them out into the pocket just so they can start getting some damage. And we see the Romans line kind of like diminishing. We are going to have Nicostratus supporting the mercenary hoplites and breaking two of the Roman troops back and disrupting another at the very right of our formation now. Again, if you had angled this around turn the screen like 90 degrees at this point, because again, the battle is kind of shifted over to our extreme, what had formerly been our extreme left, to make that our center. I'm going to move these pike buildings up behind the elephants, because in the event that those elephants have a tough time, I want something there to kind of prevent the Romans from gaining the top of that ground again. I'm also going to have my armored cavalry move over across this map, who are being harassed by the Roman skirmishers, and we've got we consider turning this pike buildings to threaten the Roman general here, and we do so in the hopes that in the future they will be able to attack them. My own Italian foot at the very north of my position are temporarily holding out there, but I believe they're going to start maneuvering around in just 1 second. However, there's still this pocket of Roman resistance over here that my slingers and archers are going to play out some quick damage with, doing 30 damage on the initial volume, with my slingers following up with a nice 27, and my light javelin throwing in for another 15. That was some nice successive damage over the course of that. And we are going to move up some more pike buildings into that pocket, because I am tired of the Romans sitting on top of this hill now at this point, and there's so few of them left that I feel very confident sitting here. I'm going to have my raw pikes charge off and kind of clear the way for my own cavalry, and have one of my cavalry kind of do the same by pushing off these guys, because I really don't want these Roman broken units coming back. I'm going to have my slingers throw into this broken Roman infantry unit, just because again, I'm trying to drive as much of them off as possible, because I don't want them coming back at all. Unfortunately, I am worried about that one archer unit that's now sitting in the center of the screen, who I just had charged the Romans who had been breaking, because this means that if a charge were to happen from those Romans on the far left center kind of position, if they were to charge up against my lights or skirmishers, there might be a chance for them to get a successful catch. However, with the percentage difference between me and the Romans, I'm not exactly very concerned by this. I am going to have Linos and his pike phalanx charge downhill, see what damage they can get against the disrupted Roman infantry. However, it is not enough to break them. Our Italian foot, as I mentioned earlier, are going to continue pushing around. They don't have too much of a choice other than just advancing this way because they're so far out of position at this point. And when I say out of position, they're only out of position just because they're so far away. Our Sinless Hoplite, fortunately, continue to hold into the Roman general. And we're going into the end of this turn with whatever Roman troops that are routing, dispersing, and completely going away. The Romans continue to move over whatever troops they have left, which isn't actually looking like a lot these days. But it's still enough to be concerned if they get one lucky break. So we're trying to avoid that, especially on that far south right position where we are now able to threaten them, kind of. As I mentioned earlier, the Roman infantry were able to charge my skirmishers who were up in the far north of my position and kind of drive them off. However, they did not get a lucky catch, especially because they went into the rough terrain doing so. And I was pretty confident about that, so there was no ability for them to get a catch against me. Unfortunately, my citizens' pikes do disrupt at this point when the general attacks them in the successive melee, and although they didn't break, they continue to be disrupted. However, that little pocket that had been there continues to go our way. The Romans finally break over there, and at this point the Romans have lost so much of percentage, although it's not the designated 45%, I guess the game considers it close enough, that we are able to gain a victory. If we hadn't, that Roman general wasn't too far off. Looking at the end results, we can see that the Romans have lost 21,000, which is about 46% of them, and that brings us to the end of this battle, which sits up for around